historical kid, and one day, everybody will die. I will die one day too. I probably have a long time, because, I'm a kid, and I'm pretty much going to be like YouTube's president kid, at least. And there's 39 presidents that have passed away, and we are going to be talking about how every president in American history died. People say that president is the most dangerous job in history because there are no presidents that have died from old age. And so, if you want to know, there are 8 presidents that have died in office, and that would make it 18% of the presidents that died while in office. And 4 presidents were assassinated, and that would make it 9% of the presidents. Well, the thing is, we are also going to be going through the last words of every U.S. president as well. People hope to, die in their sleep, because, they don't notice. And, let's say some of us hope for painful deaths, kind of. And so, we are going to go in order from when they died, not in order of the president's number. So, it's a little mixed up, but let's just get into it. George Washington, our first president, was the first president to die. He died on December 14th, 1799. He mostly died of epiglottitis. It's like what that thing is in your throat. It's similar to a throat infection. And his doctors also tried using bloodletting. And nearly 40% of his blood drained. He was 67, and his last words were, "'Tis well." After that, 2 presidents died on the exact same day. Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president, and John Adams, the 2nd president. The day they died was July 4th, 1826, the country's 50th anniversary, and the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which they both signed. So, Thomas Jefferson died first, so we're going to talk about how he died. His death was painful. He had toxemia from a kidney infection, uremia from a severe kidney damage, and pneumonia on top of that. He was 83, and his last recorded words are, "No, doctor, nothing more." But the 3 people present at the time of his death all noted that he either stated or asked about the date shortly before his death. The date was July 4th, of course, which I mentioned. Historian likes to remember him as closing out his time on Earth with this fitting speech. "Is it the 4th? I resign my spirit to God, my daughter, and my country." And then, a few hours after, John Adams passed away, and his death was very sudden. He died from a heart failure, and he knew that Thomas Jefferson died hours before him, and his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was 90. James Monroe was the next president to die. Monroe also died on the 4th of July. He died from tuberculosis and heart failure on July 4th, 1831, exactly 5 years after Thomas Jefferson and John Adams passed. He was talking to James Madison, the 4th president, who was a very good friend of Monroe. His last words were, "I regret that I should leave this world without again beholding him." He was 73. James Madison, the 4th president, was next. He died from heart failure. He died on June 28, 1836, almost on the 4th of July. He was 85. His last words were, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear. I always talk better lying down." It was his response when one of his nieces asked him, "What is the matter?" William Henry Harrison was next, and he was the first president to die while in office, just 31 days into his presidency, making his presidency the shortest in U.S. history. William Henry Harrison's inaugural address lasted nearly 2 hours, but in the days before electronic media, oratory of such duration was common. During the address, the new president wore no coat or hat. Within days, he had a cold which developed into pneumonia. People also argue that it was typhoid, a bacterial disease spread through contaminated food and water or close contact. He was 68. He died on April 4th, 1841, and his last words were, "I understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." 4 years later, Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, was the 7th president to die. He died from edema, also called chronic dropsy, and heart failure on June 8, 1845, at the age of 78. His last words were, "I hope to meet each of you in heaven. Be good, children, all of you, and strive to be ready when the change comes." And then John Quincy Adams, the 6th president, died from a stroke on February 23rd, 1848. Also, at that time, he was a representative of Massachusetts. He was 80, and his last words were, "This is the last of earth. I am content." James Polk died the next year on June 15th, 1849. He died from cholera. It was probably from drinking contaminated water. He died only 3 months after he left office. Bouts of uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea deprived the body of fluids, leading to death from dehydration. Sarah, as you might have already assumed, was his wife. She was with him when he died, and his last words were, "I love you, Sarah, for all eternity. I love you." He was just 53. Zachary Taylor was next, and he was the 2nd president to die while in office. He was only a year and a half into his presidency. He was 65. He died from gastroenteritis, also called stomach flu, and stomach virus. Historians might have also argued that he had food poisoning from eating cherries. His last words were, "I regret nothing, but I am sorry to leave my friends." But historians think what he really meant was, "I regret nothing except for snacking on those cherries." After that, 2 presidents died the same year in 1862. First was the 10th president, John Tyler, on January 18th, and then the 8th president, Martin Van Buren, on July 24th. Tyler died from a stroke. He was 71, and shortly before he passed away, he drank some brandy and he said, "Doctor, I am going." His doctor said, "I hope not, sir." Tyler then replied, "Perhaps it is best." Also, he is the only president to be buried with a Confederate flag instead of an American flag. And then Martin Van Buren died in July, 6 months after Tyler. He died from heart failure and asthma. He was 79, and he lived to see 8 presidents succeed him after leaving office. But Jimmy Carter has to live to see 1 more presidency, and then he will live to see 8. His last words were, "There is but one reliance." Next to die was the first president to be assassinated while in office. That would be Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, his wife, and friends went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to attend the play Our American Cousin. At 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth entered the president box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. I actually got to visit that place last summer, and it is my profile picture. After that, Lincoln was taken to the Peterson House for a coma, and then 8 hours later, Lincoln died. I got to visit that place too. His last words were, "She won't think anything about it." His remark to his wife, who was wondering what their female theater companion would think if she saw Mary Todd hanging on her husband so much. He was just 56. Next to die was James Buchanan. He died on June 1st, 1868. He died from respiratory failure and rheumatic gout. His last words were, "O Lord God Almighty, as thou wilt." But to be honest, I doubt these were his last words. He was 77. Franklin Pierce was next. He died on October 8th, 1869. He died from inflammation of the stomach at the age of 64. Pierce was also suffering from cirrhosis of the liver. He was also a heavy drinker for much of his life, and he always drank alcohol. So basically, that is what killed him. We do not know his last words. Next to die was Millard Fillmore. He died from a stroke on March 8th, 1874, at the age of 74. And shortly before he died, he was being fed some soup. And after he finished the bowl of soup, he said, "The nourishment is palatable." Andrew Johnson died the next year on July 31st, 1875. He also died from a stroke. He was 66, and he was also a senator of Tennessee at the time. Also, at that time, he was the only surviving past president. Also, he was the 17th president and the 17th president to die. His last words were, "Oh, do not cry. Be good children, and we shall meet in heaven." That's similar to Andrew Jackson's last words, aren't they? James Garfield was the next president to die, and he was the second president to be assassinated while in office. On July 2nd, 1881, Garfield went to the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. At 9:30 a.m., Charles Guiteau came up to Garfield and shot him twice, once in the back and once in the arm. Afterward, Garfield shouted, "My God, what is this?" But those are not his last words. After getting shot, Garfield was actually recovering and surviving until his doctor screwed things up while trying to get the bullet out. It was severe infection. On September 19th, 1881, Garfield died from septic shock. His last words refer to General David Swaim. Swaim was clutching the pain in his chest, and then he said, "Swaim, can't you stop the pain? Oh, Swaim." Yeah, it seemed like a painful death. He was just 49. 4 years later, Ulysses Grant died from throat cancer at the age of 63, and he had been suffering from it for at least a year. His last word was water. Chester Arthur died the next year from a stroke at the age of 57. Arthur's last words are not recorded, but a friend said his almost last words were, "Life is not worth living." Rutherford Hayes was the next president to die. He died from a heart attack at the age of 70. His last words were, "I know I am going where Lucy is." Lucy was his wife. Now, where do you think she was? It might be what you think is. Hayes thought she went to heaven. That makes sense because Lucy died 4 years before he did. Next to die was Benjamin Harrison. He died on March 13th, 1901, and was the first president to die in the 20th century. He caught influenza, which later turned into pneumonia. He was 67. His last words make sense. They were, "Are the doctors here? Doctor, my lungs." I know, pneumonia sucks. William McKinley was the third president to be assassinated while in office. He died a little bit over 6 months after Harrison. On September 6th, 1901, McKinley went to the Temple of Music in Buffalo, New York. At 4:07 p.m., Leon Czolgosz shot McKinley twice in the stomach. The days after that, he was recovering, but then he died from gangrene, the death of a tissue that occurs in the extremities or skin from loss of blood supply. I am not showing you pictures of it because it is gross. His last words were, "Goodbye, all, goodbye. It is God's way. His will be done." That was a response to Ida, McKinley's wife, who said, "I want to go too." Grover Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th president, was the 24th president to die. He suffered from a heart attack and died at the age of 71. Historians also argued he died from coronary sclerosis, paralysis, or intestinal obstruction. His last words were, "I have tried so hard to do right." Me too, Grover. Next to die was Theodore Roosevelt. On the night of January 5th, 1919, he would have been struggling to breathe. His doctor gave him some treatment, and then he was starting to feel better. And then after he went to bed, he never woke up. Roosevelt died in his sleep, and that is why his last words were, "Please put out that light, James." He was talking to James Amos before he drifted it off. Also, Thomas Marshall, who was vice president at the time, famously said, "Death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." He mostly died from coronary occlusion by a blood clot. He was just 60. Warren Harding was the 6th president to die while in office, and the 3rd president to die in office of natural causes. Harding went to the West Coast, and he experienced severe stomach and chest pains. He started to feel better, and then he went to San Francisco. And then he was not feeling good again. He died from a heart attack, and he died at the Palace Hotel. On August 2nd, 1923, Harding's wife, Florence, was reading a newspaper about him. And when Florence paused, Harding said, "That's good. Go on, read some more." Those were his last words. He was just 57. Woodrow Wilson died a little over 6 months after Harding. He died from a stroke at the age of 67. A few years before that, he was almost killed because he was suffering from a severe stroke. His last words were, "When the machinery is broken, I am ready." William Howard Taft was next. He died from heart disease, probably because of how heavy he was. He is known as the heaviest president in American history, but in his final years, he lost over 100 pounds by eating healthier foods and exercising. He was also serving as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time. He was 72, and we do not know his last words. 3 years later, Calvin Coolidge died from a heart attack at the age of 60. His last words were, "Good morning, Robert." Robert was a carpenter working on his house. Franklin Roosevelt was the 7th president to die while in office. He died from a stroke, but historians argue that he died from a cerebral hemorrhage. At that time, he had been in office for more than 12 years and was just reelected for a 4th time. Historians also argue he died from melanoma, which is a type of skin cancer. His last words were, "I have a terrific headache." John F. Kennedy was the next president to die, and he was the most recent president to die in office, and the 4th president to be assassinated. He died from gunshot wounds, and there's actually a video of it. You can go look it up if you want to. So at the Dealey Plaza, Lee Harvey Oswald shot the first bullet at Kennedy in the throat, and then he was shot through his brain. 2 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald was murdered back. His last words were, "No, you certainly can't." That was a response to Nellie Connolly, who had said, "Mr. President, you certainly can't say that Dallas doesn't love you." He was 46, and Kennedy is the youngest president to die in American history. The next year, Herbert Hoover died from massive internal bleeding. We do not know his last words, but he was 90. 5 years later, Dwight D. Eisenhower died from heart failure. He was 78. Also, as president, he also suffered from a heart attack. His last words were, "I want to go. God, take me." Harry Truman was next. He died from mild lung congestion, organ failures, cardiovascular system collapse, hypotension, and he was also struggling with pneumonia. He was 88, and we don't know his last words. Lyndon Johnson died just less than a month after Truman. Johnson died from a heart attack at the age of 64. His last words were, "Send Mike immediately." Mike was his Secret Service agent who was housed in a compound 100 yards away from the main house at Johnson's Texas ranch. When agents arrived in Johnson's bedroom, he was already dead. Next was Richard Nixon. He died from a stroke, paralysis, and swelling of the brain. His last word makes so much sense. It was help. He was 81. Ronald Reagan was next. He died from pneumonia and was also struggling with Alzheimer's disease. But something worse, Reagan nearly became the 5th president to be assassinated while in office and survived a gunshot wound 2 months into his presidency in 1981. We don't know Reagan's last words, but we do know that he was 93. Gerald Ford died 2 years later from arteriosclerotic cerebrovascular disease and diffuse arteriosclerosis. But people argue he died from heart issues. He was also 93, and we also don't know his last words. And last but not least, we have the most recent president to die, and that is George H.W. Bush, who died of Parkinson's disease on November 30th, 2018. He was 94, and he was the oldest lived president, and now Jimmy Carter is the longest lived president. His last words were, "I love you too." He was talking to his son, George W. Bush, who had said he had been a wonderful father. In conclusion, you might have noticed that most of them have lived long lives. So, the thing is, this was a lot of work, and for all 39 presidents that have died, most of them have died of natural causes, and that's normal. And also, this video was my parents' idea, so shout out to them. And the last, so a few things I have to tell you before we go. This was an inspiration from Mr. Beat. This is not a copy, most of them have died from heart failures and strokes. So watch that blood pressure, and don't forget to buckle your safety harnesses.